Hello Mandela class, welcome to your first Talk for Writing lesson for this week. Your learning objective today is, can I use a variety of sentence starters? One of your challenges last week when writing a paragraph to describe what the object looked like, you were also challenged to start each sentence in a different way. Now, we gave you examples in that lesson, but in this lesson, we're going to look very carefully at different ways of starting a sentence, which should help you become more creative with the way you're starting your sentence, which also makes it nicer for the reader when they're reading your paragraphs, because it sounds less repetitive. So, we're going to improve our sentences by using a variety of sentence starters. And we're going to explore 6 different ways to start sentences, and then I'll show you examples of how to use each one. When writing our non-chronological report, I would really want us to try and be more creative with the way that we start our sentences to sound less repetitive and to challenge ourselves even more. So here are the 6 different ways. We can start the sentence with the subject followed by the verb, and we will look more closely at each of these methods. You can start your sentence with information that tells us where something is happening or when something is happening. You could also start a sentence with a question. You could start the sentence with a word that ends with ing, ed, or ly, li. A lot of you are actually quite good at using this. For example, firstly, secondly, but there are also other ways. Rather than a word that tells you when, there are also other words that you can use, which we will explore further. So let's start with the subject. So when starting a sentence with the subject, you put the subject first and then the verb. The subject could be a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. And the verb is the action word, the doing word, that tells you what the subject is doing. So let's look at some examples. So here we've got one sentence. I is the subject, cooked is the verb, spaghetti. I cooked spaghetti. So we've started the sentence with a subject followed by a verb. Can you think of any sentences that start with a subject and are followed by a verb? You can pause the video and say this out loud. Okay, another example is the dog ran home. Again, we've started the sentence with the dog, which is our subject, and the doing word or the action word ran home. Okay, now that we've looked at example sentences, can you pause the video and have a think about, so this is our subject. Can you, or something else could be our subject, but it's about this image. Can you come up with a sentence that starts with the subject and is followed by a verb? Ignore me, this does not need to, the actual sewing machine does not need to be the subject. You can also use a different subject, but it just has to be related to this picture. Okay. What examples did you think about? For example, you could have said something like, I used the sewing machine last night to sew or to fix my trousers. I is the subject, used is the doing word or the verb. You could have also said something like the sewing machine. So you could have used the subject, the sewing machine as the subject. The sewing machine broke last night as I had been using it for many hours. You could have come up with a variety of different sentences about this picture. You could have used I as a subject, or any other examples. You could have used the sewing machine as the subject, but it just has to start with a subject followed by a verb. Okay, the second example of how you could start a sentence. Going back, we've looked at the subject. Now we're going to look at how we can use where or when to start our sentences. Okay, so this is when you explain where or when something happened. The sentence can start with words that tell you where something is happening or when something is happening. For example, where or when examples are on top of, so that tells us where something is happening. Next to, again, that tells us where something is happening. Beneath, that also tells us where something is happening. On the side of, that also tells us where something's happening. After, before, that tell us when something is happening or when something happened. So these are some examples. You can think of many more, I'm sure. So, a word that tells us where or when something is happening, do you remember what that's called? A word that tells us where, when, or how something is happening. Do you remember what that's called? It's related to a verb. It's called an adverb, something that describes when, where, or how something is happening. Now, if you're starting a sentence with an adverb or with a word that tells us where or when something is happening, what do we call that? Well, when the adverb is at the front of a sentence, it is called a fronted adverbial. Well done to those of you who remembered. Let's look at some examples of sentences that start by telling us where something is happening. On the road, there is a Victorian car. Does that tell us when or where? It tells us where something is happening. On the road, there is a Victorian car. Next to the car, again telling us where, there is a building. What do you notice after they've used the where in the beginning of their sentence? Well done for spotting the comma. Now, if you remember, when using fronted adverbials, we always follow it with a comma before carrying on with the rest of our sentence, which is also a reminder here. Now, let's look at some sentences that have started with the information of when something is happening. So, during the school trip, we saw a Victorian car. Before school, I saw a Victorian car. Both of them starting with a word that tells us when something is happening. Again, it's a fronted adverbial, so it needs to be followed with a comma, which is also reminded to you here. Okay, we've looked at two ways of starting a sentence. We've looked at starting it with a subject and a verb, and we've looked at starting it with information that tells us when or where something happened. There's another way of starting a sentence, which is our third method. You can start a sentence with a question. Have you ever thought of starting a sentence with a question? It starts by making the reader think about something. So it makes them go, have I actually thought about this or have I not thought about this? So some examples are, did you know? So if you start your sentence with, did you know that this and this and this was the case, the reader might think, oh, did I know that? Or did I not know that? Were you aware that? Have you ever thought that? So it makes the reader question themselves, and it makes them possibly more interested. And if they find out information that they didn't know, they might think, oh, actually, I didn't know that. I've learned something by reading this piece of information. Can you think of an example that we might have in the text map about the electric hairbrush that starts with a question? Well, the last part of our text map says, did you know that the oldest hairbrush is 230 years old? Well, I personally didn't know that information. So, and having started the sentence with, did you know, made me question it more, made me more interested. Here are some examples. Did you know that the first motor car was built in 1885 and only had 3 wheels? Well, that's interesting. And remember, when you start a sentence with a question, you must also use the correct punctuation. Were you aware that? That in itself makes me more interested because I'm thinking they're going to give me information that I might not be aware of. Were you aware that the first people who drove cars in the Victorian times had to have someone walk in front of them with a red flag? No, I wasn't aware of that piece of information. And starting the sentence with were you aware that makes me even more interested in finding that information out. Remember to use your question mark because it's a question. Now, the fourth way that we could start a sentence is with words ending, well, action words or verbs ending in ed. You can start a sentence with these words as well. For example, invented in whatever year, designed by a person, desired by, created for. You can use these words as sentence starters, and we will have a look at how. Here are some examples. For example, invented in 1804, comma, because it's also telling us when something is happening, but it started with the ed word. Invented in 1804, the first steam train was very useful to transport iron and men. Designed by Richard Trevithick, the steam train was incredibly useful when transporting goods. So both of these sentences are starting with words that end in ed. Invented in 1804, and the rest of the information about what was invented in 1804. Designed by Richard Trevithick is also starting with the ed word that tells us who designed it. So designed by this person was this item. Can you think of a way of starting a sentence with the ed word to do with our text map? So, for example, you know who it was invented by. For example, invented by or designed by Dr. George Scott was the very famous electric hairbrush, which was said to cure baldness. That's just an example. You may have thought of different examples. Now, the fifth way of starting a sentence is with words ending in ing. For example, thinking of, paying close attention to, designing with this in mind, anticipating its success, hoping it would be a success. Ing. And we will look at some more examples to help you visualize this a bit more. For example, paying close attention to the chimney, we can see a lot of smoke coming out. We've started the sentence with a word that ends in ing. Designing with passengers in mind, some Victorian trains had carriages to transport people from one place to another. So designing with passengers in mind. Finally, words that end in ly. There's an example for you right there. Finally, the last way to start a sentence is by using an ly word. And in us telling you that, we've also used a word that ends in ly. So make sure you put a comma straight after using the ly word. For example, finally, usually, amazingly, normally, surprisingly, unfortunately. Let's look at some examples. Amazingly, comma, the electric hairbrush was said to cure headaches as well as making your hair longer. Usually, there would be more than one of these electric hairbrushes in each household. Okay, we've finished looking at the different ways you could start a sentence, and here is a word mat to help you, which would be very useful for your activity. We've got examples of each of the methods that we've just looked at. So your task is, using what we have just learned and using the word mat, please can you improve my paragraph below by using appropriate sentence starters. It's up to you which one you choose, but please make sure that each of your sentences starts in a different way. This is about a Victorian teapot. So the paragraph is, it has beautiful, intricate detail on the front. It has a small, delicate silver bird. It has a long silver spout. The oldest teapot is over 500 years old. Can you go back to your word mat and think about different ways that you could start each of these sentences? As an extension, if you want to challenge yourself even more, you can add even more sentences to this paragraph to add more information. I look forward to seeing all your creative paragraphs on Tapestry. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, Mandela class.